good program ahead for us, and it's good to see you. I'd like to introduce Dr. Erik Johnson. Erik is the Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon Louisiana. Erik joined Audubon in April 2011 as a conservation biologist for the Mississippi Flyway and Gulf Coast Initiative, where he provided science support and guidance for Audubon's strategic planning process in the region. Before coming to Audubon, Erik's graduate work at LSU included researching the effects of forest fragmentation on Amazonian bird communities and understanding the effects of fire management on grassland birds in pine savannas of the southeastern United States. Erik was finishing his dissertation when the BP oil spill occurred, and in response, he helped develop Audubon's Coastal Bird Survey, which is a citizen science program across the central Gulf Coast, and he still continues to lead that today. Erik started his ornithological career stewarding and monitoring breeding least terns and piping plovers in Massachusetts, and has also led the development of a comprehensive beach nesting bird stewardship program in Louisiana. Erik is active in Louisiana's birding community and serves as Louisiana's Christmas Bird Count Regional Editor, a member of the Louisiana's Bird Records Committee, Vice President of the Baton Rouge Audubon Society, and co-director of the Louisiana Bird Observatory. Erik also has numerous publications and lives in Lafayette, Louisiana. So with a fantastic bird for our program, please welcome Dr. Erik Johnson.
Great turnout today. Thanks so much for coming. It's a real honor to come back to Mississippi. I got to do some birding this morning with Nick Winstead and Nicole Hodges, so I appreciate their time. We actually got to see a Prothonotary this morning, so woo! First thing, icebreaker, I want everybody to say Prothonotary Warbler. Prothonotary Warbler, all right. How many here are bird watchers? How many here know how to say Prothonotary Warbler? You're all bird watchers. So thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about our work in Louisiana with this species. We've been working with them since 2013 or so. But the backdrop to this is that literally billions of birds every year are migrating across the hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, from North America, Central America, South America. There's this wave of bird movement. And the geniuses at Cornell Lab of Ornithology put this diagram together, and each one of these points represents a centroid of a species of bird, of its distribution. And you can see how over the course of the year, these birds just move across the hemisphere. It's this amazing migration. And Prothonotary warblers, you can imagine, is one of these dots, is one of these species. So each bird, each species has its own story. And some of our work with the Prothonotary warblers to figure out what that story is and how to tell it in such a way that we can preserve these birds, because they are amazing. So our vision for conservation is to look at that entire life cycle, what these birds need across their breeding grounds, their wintering grounds, while they're migrating. What do they need across the entire hemisphere in order to survive? We can try to protect habitat here, and we can do some good. But if we ignore what's happening on those other portions of their life cycle, we may be missing the mark to conserve these birds. And again, the geniuses at eBird, at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, put this together, showing the migration of Prothonotary warblers in the United States. And you can see in the spring they come up the Mississippi River Valley, up the Atlantic coastal plain. They breed, and then very quickly, quietly disappear back into the tropics. So we borrow these birds really for only a few months out of every year. And in fact, some of our work is showing that individual birds may only be spending 4 months in southern Louisiana. The rest of the time, they're spending somewhere else, somewhere to our south. So where did they go, and what's happening to them? So this is a species that's a top conservation priority. It's obviously a bird in many people's hearts. It's beautiful. It sings loud. It's this candle in the swamp. It's this wonderful sort of announcement of spring when the Prothonotary Warblers come back every year. But their populations are declining. They've been disappearing steadily for decades. And since the 1960s, we've lost about 40% of the global population of this bird. And if you look at how fast we've been losing the habitat on the breeding grounds, it doesn't explain this decline. So they're actually declining faster than we're losing the breeding habitat. And if you look instead at how fast their wintering habitat, primarily mangroves in Central and Northern South America, there's actually a pretty tight correlation between the population declines that we're observing here in the breeding grounds and the habitat loss on the wintering grounds. So it begs the question, where do they go? And what can we do? So here they are. Here's a breeding range across the southeastern United States. It's a bird of the cypress tupelo swamps, bottomland hardwood forests. Very familiar common birds in the right habitat. You get outside of that habitat up into the hills a little bit and you don't see them anymore. And in the winter, we pretty much think they winter in mangrove forests. We do know that they use some other habitats as well throughout Central and South America, Northern South America. And these are really hard places to work in a lot of times. This is some red mangrove forests in Costa Rica. This is wintering habitat for some Prothonotary warblers. It took college students, I was somewhere in this group, I probably took the picture, college students like an hour to go about a quarter of a mile. It was really hard to get through this sort of habitat. So there hasn't actually been a lot of work done on the species in the wintering grounds. There are some groups working on them now, and I'll talk more about that a little bit. So these birds arrive in the spring. The males usually get here first. They start singing. They start setting up their territories. They're competing with other males to set up these territories, and they try to lure and attract females to their territory that they've set up. And the male is very similar to the female, but brighter yellow in the head. The female is a little bit more of that olive wash across her nape and her head. So you can tell them apart in the field when you're looking at them with your binoculars. And they're what we call secondary cavity nesters. So they don't make their own cavity, but they rely on cavities created by something else. So like a woodpecker or a chickadee can make their own cavity, and Prothonotaries may use that cavity, but they'll also use broken off crooks and stumps of roots or old decaying trees. And they usually lay 3 to 6 eggs, more like 4 to 5 more often. And typically they raise 2 broods a year. So they get here in late March, they start a nest, they raise their young, those young fledge, and then they'll nest again. And then they migrate south. And we're actually learning with some of our banded birds, we color band our birds for our study, that some of them are nesting 3 times in South Louisiana. As far as I know, that hasn't been documented in the literature, so kind of interesting how many birds they could actually potentially put out into the world every year. They incubate their eggs for about 12 to 14 days. And then, when the little naked ugly chicks hatch, it takes them only 11 days to go from this little nugget with sort of soft bones into something that flies away from the nest, never to return. So they grow up quickly. Miraculously, on day 5, they get this little silver thing around their leg. We go in and we band the nestlings to keep track of them as well. And we do other kinds of measurements with them. But they look pretty gangly when they come out, and they can actually swim. So if they can't fly well enough when they fledge the nest, they land in water. They often nest over water. They can actually swim to the nearest log, and then the parents will take care of them from there. So this is a bird that eats mostly insects during the breeding season. Eats a lot of things that come out of the water, mayflies, dragonflies. I've actually seen them picking off this golden skimmer that's almost as long as the Prothonotary warbler is. They're really voracious hunters. They're amazing hunters. They eat a lot of spiders. I've seen them delivering golden orb weavers to their nestlings. They take all the legs off and bring the body of the golden orb weaver to their nestlings. They're amazing predators, dinosaurs. You can really think of them as vicious dinosaurs. So they're wonderful, wonderful predators. They go down to the non-breeding season and they supplement that insect diet with a lot of fruit. They'll sometimes eat mollusks, sometimes seeds, sometimes they'll even eat nectar. You can see them in spring migration at mulberry trees, for example. They will eat those in migration as well. When the breeding season is over, everybody molts. The adults molt, the babies molt. The babies put on their adult feathers. They get really quiet. So at this time of year, it's really hard to find a Prothonotary warbler because they're no longer singing, they're no longer breeding. They're either molting or just finished their molt, and then they head south for the winter. I put a question mark here because I'm not entirely convinced that some birds may be migrating and molting at the same time. We're still trying to figure that out. And the last birds are found along the northern Gulf of Mexico in October, and then we have to wait till March to see them again. And then spring comes anew. So one of the ways we've been working with them, and I know Reese and Patricia, there you are, you all do the same thing with nest boxes here. It's a great way to attract Prothonotary warblers to suitable habitat. And we do a couple of things as well. So we put a predator guard on below the box. So it keeps the snakes out, it keeps the raccoons out. We can really boost productivity that way, nesting success. We use these very sophisticated devices called Tupperware. It's amazingly easy to put together, and they're not picky. So we drill in a 1 1/4 inch hole, and they take them quite readily. We actually did an experiment, not this past year, but the year before, where we put a Tupperware nest box and a wooden nest box side by side. What do you think they would have chosen? Wooden, right? It's natural. Well, 2 to 1, they picked the Tupperware over the wood. If anyone has a good explanation for that, I would love to know. We don't know. But they were the same dimensions, the same height, oriented the same direction, but they seem to choose the Tupperware ones. You do have to replace them after a couple of years. They break down. The wooden ones last longer. But they also seem to have fewer wasps in them, which is another sort of added benefit. How many times have you gotten stung by wasps? Yeah, you can't count that high. Yeah. The other thing that we've done with these cavity holes of 1 1/4 inch is we've excluded cowbirds as a nest parasite. In 235 nesting attempts, we've never had a cowbird enter the box. When you use a cavity of 1 1/2 inches or something a little bit bigger than 1 1/4, the cowbirds can get in and lay their egg. And for those of you who don't know what cowbirds are, they take over their nest. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and the chicks hatch bigger, and they're more aggressive, and they grow faster, and they outcompete the host nestlings, and they take over. So it can drive nesting success down, particularly where you have forest edges. That cowbirds like to be out in the open areas, but they can invade the forest and lay their eggs in other birds' boxes. So we've managed to avoid that from happening using these nest boxes. You also want to place your nest boxes away from overhanging vegetation, at least 4 feet away, so that snakes can't get in or flying squirrels or something can't jump into them. But they'll take almost anything. They're not very picky. We've just figured out this is a nice and efficient way of getting nest boxes out there that we can monitor and check on. But there's lots of different ways of doing it. And if you could push the play button, it should show up on the bottom of the screen. And if you're looking for nest box instructions, I have some paperwork down here if you want to take some home with you. So this is a box that the high school group built for us. They actually put these metal sheets on as predator guards, which also seem to work pretty well. And here's a female Prothonotary warbler. I'm shooting this with my cell phone about 2 feet away from the box. So they're very endearing birds, very cooperative. So she's stuffing it full. Usually the male will sort of start building the nest. He'll put in some nesting material in a bunch of different boxes or cavities, and I think the female ultimately decides which one she wants. And she finishes off the nest. And there she goes. So they're very, very fun birds to work with. Here's a completed nest. We actually like to start the nest with some wood shavings. It helps keep the moisture down a little bit. But here are some 4-day-old little babies waiting to be fed. So we have been growing this program ever since 2013. We started at Bluebonnet Swamp. And so for orientation, this is the border of Texas here on the west, the border of Mississippi here on the east. So we work at 9 different sites across South Louisiana. We started at Bluebonnet Swamp and have slowly been expanding our nest box work to these different sites. So just this last year, we had 140 active 140 nest boxes that we kept track on. We'd visit them about twice a week. And over the years, this is sort of just the general success of what we've seen. The blue is the average clutch size, so the number of eggs that they lay, and the average numbers of chicks that fledged, including from boxes that weren't successful. So, 89% of all of our nests fledged at least 1 chick. And most of our nests are fledging somewhere on the order of 3 chicks for every single nesting attempt. So we've, put over 650 nestlings into the world over these last few years. So it's a great way to sort of boost local productivity and increase nesting success. And the other interesting thing that we've noticed is that in the first year we put out the nest boxes at the site, nest success is typically 100%. And after time, that nesting success goes down a little bit. It's still not as low as sort of natural levels. Natural nest success might be 40%, 50%. And there's probably lots of things that are going on that's causing that. There may be some avian predators like broadwing hawks that have figured out our nests. We actually have a video of an adult broadwing hawk sticking its talons trying to get nestlings out of the box. Occasionally snakes will find the box. There may be other predators like flying squirrels, and there may be competition with each other as well. So as we put more boxes out there, we get more and more Prothonotaries, which sounds great, but they start competing with each other, and they can take over each other's boxes and cause one nest to abandon so that they will lay their eggs in that nest. But it's an interesting pattern. And then we can also look at things and compare the quality of the forest. So we looked at small patches of habitat versus extensive patches of habitat. And we looked at the nestling growth rates. So we'd weigh the nestlings when they're young, we'd weigh them again when they're older. And as they age, they gain weight at basically the same rate between these two types of habitats. So it suggests that those smaller habitats do have intrinsic value. They may be harder for birds to deal with cowbirds. Maybe there isn't as much habitat available, but if they can get a nest in, they can take advantage of the resources there to raise their young. The other thing we've been doing is banding adult birds. And so we'll capture adults and we'll put color bands on them, uniquely color banded combinations so that we can track them as they come back from year to year. And about every year, they come back at about 50%. And this was sort of, we noticed this even before 2014. We had a banding project ongoing at Bluebonnet Swamp in Baton Rouge, and we started noticing some of our Prothonotaries coming back. And so that sort of takes me into the next part of our research on them. But we've banded over, probably close to 200, 250 birds over the last few years. And many of them come back from year to year, so it's always nice to see their return. So we've taken advantage of what we call site fidelity, those birds that we band in one year and come back to that spot the next year. And we have been tracking the migration of individual birds using this little device called a geolocator. So a geolocator is basically a little data logger, like a little miniature computer, powered by a battery that has a light reader. So it's every 2 minutes, it's measuring the amount of light around the bird. And if it's sunny, it'll get lots of light. If it's dark, overnight, it won't register any light. And we can use that to estimate day length and solar noon, which gives us latitude and longitude for any given day of the year. So if this bird is carrying this device for a year, it put it on in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, it flies south, it comes back to Baton Rouge a year later, we can recapture that bird, download the data off the bird, and figure out basically where it's been using these meteorological type data. So, these birds are so small, they only weigh 5 pennies, the equivalent of 5 pennies. You can't put like a big GPS on the bird, or you can't put a satellite transmitter on the bird. They just don't make those technologies small enough that this bird can carry. These devices weigh about 3% of the bird's body weight. So 3% of 5 pennies is basically half a gram, and these birds can carry them for a year of their life. So this is how we catch a Prothonotary. I often get that question. How do you catch these birds? One is, how do you find them, right? So you have to go into the swamp and you have to find your bird with the color band. And we use this very convincing decoy. Looks just like a Prothonotary warbler. He even squeaks a little bit too if you squeeze him. And we put out a tape, and you can see it right there, right? It's not far away. You put out a tape of the male song, and a male will think, it'll see this bright yellow, it'll hear the other male singing, and it'll come in and try to chase that bird away. And if we put up a mist net with all the appropriate permits to do so, we can capture these birds, color band them, and then attach a geolocator to them, or retrieve a geolocator a year later. Females are a little bit different. You can actually catch them when they're incubating. While they're incubating the nest box, you can put like a little net over the hole, knock on the door, and she'll come out into your net. You do need the appropriate permits to do that, just to say. So we experimented with that in 2013 through our banding station through the Louisiana Bird Observatory at Bluebonnet Swamp. Remember I said these birds come back every year. We started noticing that at our Bluebonnet Swamp station. So we put out basically 2 geolocators on 2 birds. And we had a long wait over the winter. This was like in July 2013, and we had to wait till March, April the next year. It was a long, hard winter for us. But on March 24th, one of our super volunteers, John Hartgerink, whose many of his photos are in this PowerPoint, he heard a Prothonotary warbler singing at the nest box where we put one of the geolocators on a bird. And, we dropped everything. We went out there looking for this bird, and it was there. It had the color band. We could see the geolocator on the back of the bird. We were thrilled. Now we had to try to catch it, and we couldn't catch it. So we went back. We didn't sleep at all that night. We went back the first thing the next morning, and lo and behold, we caught it. So this is the first Prothonotary warbler that had a successful geolocator recovery with data on it. And so we named him Geodad because he was the father of this project. And it turns out he left Baton Rouge in late July, right at the end of the nesting season, crossed the Gulf of Mexico, spent some time around the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, a good bit of time, and then kept going east to Cuba, and then hung out in Jamaica for a month, and then did another major water crossing and ended up on the border of Colombia and Panama, where it spent the rest of the winter. So it took them almost 3.5 months to get there. Remember I said they only spend 4 months with us in North America. Well, this is the first picture that we had suggesting of what they do the rest of the time. And he started coming back in the beginning of March and made a beeline right for Baton Rouge. And in fact, we think the geolocator data show him basically being on the Yucatan Peninsula on the 23rd, probably flew off that night of the 23rd, arrived directly in Baton Rouge on the day of the 24th, and our volunteer heard him singing that afternoon, and that's where this story comes from. Pretty amazing. So three weeks to get back, 3.5 months to get down, 5,000 miles. All, as a minimum, straight line distances, 7 different countries at a minimum, 3 major water crossings. Pretty impressive for a bird that weighs 5 pennies. So we were thrilled. We expanded the project, and in the meantime, while we were sort of biting our nails over that winter, we started talking with other Prothonotary warbler researchers around the country about what we were doing, and they were excited about it, and they were doing great work as well, both on the breeding grounds and in the wintering grounds. And so we set up a working group of partners to deploy geolocators across 6 different states. So all of these different universities are involved. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service helped provide funding for some of this work. Smithsonian is involved. Great group of people. Randy Wilson, raise your hand. I found you. So Randy's with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's helped get some of this geolocator work off the ground. So we really appreciate that. And yeah, so now we can ask questions about what different populations of Prothonotary warblers do. Do they winter in different locations, or do they mix and go to the same locations? These questions are fundamentally important for understanding the conservation impacts of our work in the tropics. If we were to preserve, in this scenario, only habitat here, it might benefit these birds, but not the other birds. If they mix, you might get bigger bang for your buck, but it would be diluted with maybe fewer birds from each region. So, interesting implications for understanding questions like that. So we kept going with our geolocator work. We deployed more in 2014. This is GeoMom. She was the lady friend of GeoDad, but this was a year later. And she did a very similar type of thing, except this time headed down Central America. Also left in late July. Took a long time to get to her wintering grounds in northern Colombia. And then the geolocator stopped working in mid-December. We were experimenting with a few different types of geolocators, and this one just didn't have as long as a battery life. But she came back by early April, and we retrieved the geolocator off of her. And this is Steve. Steve is a bird that was banded in Steve Cardiff's yard in Baton Rouge. Steve Cardiff works with LSU. He's a great birder, great museum curator. This bird also left in late July and started heading south down through Central America and wintered also in Colombia. Interesting. And then started coming back in March, and then the geolocator stopped working in late March, so we didn't get the rest of the spring migration, but it came back certainly by mid-April, probably before then. This is a lone bird that South Carolina Audubon deployed. So they called it long shot. What are the odds of a bird with a geolocator coming back the next year? This bird actually left quite a bit later, went down through Central America, and interestingly also ended up in Colombia. I might have guessed that it would have wintered further east than our Louisiana birds. Most of them are in central Colombia, or maybe up here in the Greater Antilles, maybe Panama, but generally the same region. Here's 6 birds from central Arkansas. Thon Boves is working with that at Arkansas State University, central Colombia. We're starting to see a pattern here, are we not? And here's a few birds from Ohio State University. Cristanra has 3 units, also Colombia. So this is sort of the picture that started to emerge, and we have more geolocators that we recovered this year from several different locations, including Wisconsin now. So we'll add another point up here. And there's a lot of convergence on Colombia, which is very interesting from a conservation perspective. And if you take all of those points and put it together, this is sort of that blue dark area is the hot spot of the probability of where most of these birds are wintering. There's a couple of things interesting about this graphic. One is how concentrated it is. From birds from different breeding grounds all across the U.S. ending up here. And it turns out there's 3 ridges of the Andean mountains. The Magdalena River is a major river that comes out of the central Andes. If you've heard of Bogota, which is at about 2,600 meters, it's the headwaters of the Magdalena River. There's a very high degree of endemism of tropical birds in this valley. It's under incredible pressure to be converted to agriculture. There's lots of wetlands in the region, and there's a large delta that supports lots of mangroves. It sounds a lot like the Mississippi River, honestly, but in South America. And it's interesting that this swarm puts it away from the coast. Remember how I said the wintering grounds are thought to be largely in mangrove forests. Well, so last year, one of our partners at an organization called Selva, who's a nonprofit research organization in Colombia, Nick Bailey went looking at a couple of these spots in here that may be sort of nice wetlands with forests suitable for potentially Prothonotary warblers. He found almost none there. Meanwhile, a graduate student at Virginia Commonwealth University was working on the mangroves in northern Colombia, and she had Prothonotaries out the wazoo. Hundreds of birds commuting back and forth between some kind of night roost and their day foraging areas in the mangroves. And it turns out what happened, it's a little bit of a complicated story, but this point is probably wrong. So when you have a geolocator measuring light, it's estimating day length. And probably what is happening is that these birds are leaving their daytime foraging areas in the shadows of the forest and flying out to their wintering roost. So they're actually exposed to more light at sunrise and sundown, which actually makes the day appear longer than it would have if the bird had been in the forest. And so by the day being longer than it should have, it's actually putting the point further south, because day length is longer the further south you go in the northern hemisphere in the winter. It's complicated, but it explains why they're not seeing many birds here and lots of birds in the mangrove forest. And if we recalibrate the wintering data, this swarm will very likely shift northward into coastal Colombia, based on the biology of what these birds are actually doing. So kind of interesting to how it all kind of comes together. You have to understand the ecology of these birds in order to really accurately interpret these kind of geolocator data. But still, it tells us something very interesting about where these birds are going. And then our geolocator guru at the Smithsonian Institute, Michael Hallworth, put this animation together of the birds migrating, which is basically right now, September through October, showing sort of the probabilistic swarm of where most of these birds were on any given day of the fall migration, showing them coming down through the Yucatan, through Central America, and ultimately wintering in Colombia. So really powerful stuff you can do with these data from individual birds showing bigger picture patterns. And I'll let that run through. And there they are, mid-October, ending up more in Colombia. And obviously, individual birds are doing slightly different things, so you get these sort of artifacts that may be hard to tell what's exactly going on, but it gives you a sort of a bigger picture perspective. There's a lot we still don't know about the migration ecology of these birds. But some of the things we can start to figure out with the geolocators is when, on average, they depart from their breeding grounds. So these 2 points, we have Louisiana, Arkansas, these are southern birds. And then we have Virginia, South Carolina, Ohio, we'll call those northern birds. They're more or less leaving at the same time, on average early to mid-August. Some a little earlier, some a little later. They spend about the same amount of time in fall migration, just about 3 months, across all of these different populations. And they more or less arrive on their wintering grounds in northern Colombia around the same time, late October, plus or minus a couple weeks. What's really different, though, about these populations is how much time they appear to spend in different regions of the world. So southern birds get the heck out of the U.S. pretty quickly after breeding and spend most of their migratory period in Central America. And northern birds from Ohio, Virginia, seem to spend a good bit of their migratory periods in the U.S. and then quickly go through Central America to get to their wintering grounds in northern Colombia. This is really just a first look at the data that we have. We're hoping to get a lot more geolocator data and supplement this with other kinds of tracking technologies in the coming years. But one of the take-home stories is just how important northern Colombia may be for the Prothonotary warbler to conserve this species. And so now, we have to think about what can we do in Colombia? What can we do in Central America to preserve this sort of mangrove habitat that they appear to depend on? So next steps for us, we deployed 22 more geolocators in 2017. Next spring, we hope to get some back. If any of you are in South Louisiana and want to come hit the swamps with us and look for these birds, we'd love to have you. It's a lot of fun. It's muddy, humid, mosquito-filled work. It's great. You'll love it. You'll absolutely love it. And we received a grant to deploy nanotags on birds, which is another kind of tracking technology that does transmit a signal and relies on a stationary tower to pick up the signal. There are now towers across coastal Louisiana and coastal Texas that could potentially pick up our birds that we put tags on from Baton Rouge, from Lake Charles, from New Orleans. And we can look at the stopover ecology, the very detailed stopover ecology. When do they get to the northern Gulf Coast? How long do they stay there? Do they go around the Gulf of Mexico, or do they seem to cross right over it? So we're going to start to hopefully answer some questions about real detailed things about Cheniere Plain conservation needs for the stopover ecology. The working group that we work with are doing lots of great things. I wish I had time to talk about all of them. They're doing things with stable isotopes, with population genetics, carotenoid content of feathers, or relating these back to breeding metrics, to migratory metrics. A lot of really cool work is coming out of this group. And we're going to use all of this information to develop an international conservation plan to highlight the opportunities and the needs for conservation for this disappearing species. So lots of great people in that working group, lots of funders to thank for just the Louisiana work alone, way more for the broader working group, and lots of local partners help put this work together. So I'll take questions. You can tweet me if anyone here is a Twitter person. Every bird person should be a Twitter person. But also take questions if you have any. Thank you. Yes, in the blue.
You showed the population in northeastern South America, and none of your birds were retrieved there.
Yeah.
Where that population comes from?
No. No, so I mean, we're dealing with a fairly small number of birds still, on the order of about 20 birds that all this geolocator work is based on. So yeah, I mean, what about the birds that winter in Belize or in Guatemala? There's still a lot to figure out. Why is this concentration on Colombia? If we did more and more geolocators, would we continue to see that? And there were some birds that deviated from the central Colombia story. So it may just be a matter of scale, a matter of number of birds that are using these different areas. Colombia apparently still has a lot of habitat. Other areas may have less. That's sort of the next steps we need to figure out. Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead. Has Hurricane Harvey, can you tell if it's had any impact on the birds at this point?
Yeah, so I just remembered I'm supposed to repeat the questions for the video. So the question was, did Hurricane Harvey have an impact on the birds? And I assume you mean Prothonotary Warblers in particular. The answer is we don't know for sure. I mean, certainly Harvey came through at a location at a time of year when Prothonotary Warblers are moving. Probably they grounded themselves. It is possible that a few were crossing the Gulf of Mexico during the storm, when the storm was still out there. But more than likely, most of them were probably just grounded on the northern Gulf of Mexico waiting for the storm to pass. Certainly areas that had a lot of wind. There's habitat destruction and side by side with all the human destruction. So those are sort of long-term impacts about stopover ecology and things like that the birds will have to adjust to. If I had one thing to say, I wouldn't say it was a devastating blow for the Prothonotary warbler, or probably most other things. But certainly the habitat destruction is something that people are going to be thinking about over the next few months and years in southeast Texas. Yeah. Yes. To like power them? Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, why don't you use a solar panel to keep the battery charged? And the problem is the solar panels are still too big and heavy to put on this bird. It's such a small bird that it wouldn't be able to carry the weight. So if you put a backpack on, you can carry a certain amount of weight, but at some point it gets too heavy to do anything. And of course, these birds have to fly like hundreds of miles across the Gulf of Mexico. So they just couldn't do it. They physically couldn't do it. They're not strong enough. Yeah, so we're stuck with these much smaller things. Yes?
Do you find that there's any negative effect on birds when placing geolocators on them?
Yeah, so that's something we've looked at, and we do have birds with color bands that don't get geolocators, so we can compare the return rates of birds with geolocators to those without. And statistically, we don't see any difference. So they're coming back at the same rate. In reality, the percentage of birds coming back with geolocators is slightly lower. It's not dramatically, so I don't know if that's a real effect or just random chance. Statistically, it doesn't seem to have an effect. Yeah.
You don't think there's any physical harm in any way from you guys like trapping and grabbing them out of this?
No, they go back to their, feeding their nestlings on a normal schedule. They come back from year to year. Yeah, they do. They're pretty resilient. Yeah, and we try to only hold them for a few minutes and take the data we need, and then they go back to their daily lives. Yeah, thanks. Yes, sir.
Yes. I know you mentioned about the males being somewhat territorial, and I just discovered a few months ago that there is a person that I know just a few miles south of here that has some property along the Pearl River that has been putting nest boxes up for several years, and I talked to her this morning, and they actually had 3 pairs that used nest boxes and successfully raised. And one question is that I want to ask you is, do you have a recommendation about how far apart nest boxes should be?
Yeah, so I get asked that question a lot too. It's how far apart should nest boxes be? I don't know the answer to that. I think it depends on a lot of things. We have seen, like in that pair side-by-side experiment, we actually had a wooden box and a plastic box occupied simultaneously. So that's within a few feet of each other, 2 different pairs. One of the nests did abandon after some time, and probably it just got to be too much with all of that activity. So one pair took over. So we typically place our boxes at least 50 feet apart, 100 feet apart. They can pack into pretty surprisingly small areas. And it's tempting to try to get more and more birds, but at the same time, spacing them apart may also help with just their own success in nesting. So I don't know what the number is, but yeah. Yes?
Can you tell us any more about the current situation on the Colombian coast as far as what's being degraded and what conservation efforts are currently being done now?
Yeah. So the question is, what's the conservation status of basically mangroves and the coast of Colombia? I can't say I'm an expert on that for sure. There's a lot I don't know, and our Virginia Commonwealth University people can answer that probably with much more detailed knowledge because they've been there. I haven't. But very little of that is actually protected. Very little is protected under federal law. There's almost no national parks. It's pretty much open to development. Mangroves have generally been and sort of avoided for development just because of the technological challenges. But that's changing as a lot of these countries are getting more advanced technologies.